Hi there. Today we are joined by Dr. Wenzong Zhao, who is the co-director of the Ronald G. Tompkins Harvard MECFS collaboration, as well as the director of the newly established Computational Research Center for Complex Diseases. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So I would love to start by talking a little bit about our newly established OMF-supported Computational Research Center for Complex Diseases, which analyzes and provides this critical information and insights into projects being conducted across all of the other OMF-supportive research centers at Stanford, Harvard, Uppsala, Montreal, and Melbourne. So just to start off, can you just explain a little bit more about what your team does at the OMF Computational Research Center?
Sure. Thank you for the questions. So we exclusively conduct computational analysis on MECFS and related diseases such as long COVID. The motivation is that we know some of these main challenges of MECFS, namely, it currently takes very long for the patients to be diagnosed with MECFS through the primary care system. And we know that there's not really an understanding of what causes MECFS and what is the molecular mechanism of the disease, likely because ME is a complex disease that affects, as we know, multiple organ systems of the body. So it's harder comparing to many other diseases to study. And on top of that, there's no effective drug available. And therefore managing symptoms is also important for the patients until effective treatments can be found. So our goal is to basically solve these challenges computationally. As we know, because human body is a complex system of many organ systems interacting with each other and working together. And also ME affects many of these systems. We use a number of computational approaches in the lab to study this complex disease, namely systems biology, network medicine, complex disease modeling, and artificial intelligence and machine learning approaches. I can give you a couple of examples of our projects.
That's great.
So one project we work on quite heavily this year is to develop and apply systems medicine algorithms to integrate the clinical phenotypes of MECFS, because as we know, ME is these days defined by symptoms only. So combining those symptoms with the molecular signatures from different studies of MECFS with the networks of the knowledge on other diseases to hopefully uncover the mechanism of MECFS and to identify new drug targets for pilot clinical trials. So that's one project that we put quite some focus on these days. We also work with a number of Open Medicine Foundation supported research teams specializing in clinical research and molecular assays to study MECFS. Here we provide support on the statistical side for the study design and perform computational analysis of the so-called omics data together with the corresponding clinical data of the studies, and also perform this network medicine-based approach to look at the results and to essentially get the biological insights from the results of these studies and get those results communicated with the research teams as well as the wider research community. So for that, we developed and we're running a MECFS data center for data sharing and online collaboration. I can also give you a couple of examples of the studies that we're currently working on. So one study that we're particularly excited about is this omics study based on invasive cardiopulmonary exercise test. And that is led by Dr. David Systrom at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. Because invasive CPET is this unique tool that can allow us to comprehensively examine the heart and lung systems of the body in the patients, because we know that post-exertion malaise is the hallmark of this disease, and invasive cardiopulmonary exercise test, ICPET, can provide this comprehensive examination of this post-exertion malaise. And on top of that, it also provides this excellent platform to subjectively evaluate the treatment effect of drugs. So Dr. Systrom's lab is doing a few of these pilot clinical trials on MECFS, and we're collaborating with his lab to do some of these trials together. And right now we're extending this capability with muscle biopsies, so we can not only look at the heart and lung functions of the patients, but also look at the skeletal muscle system of the patients to better understand fatigue and post-exertion malaise. So this is one of the projects I think would likely get us important findings to understand the disease. Another collaboration we have is with Janet Milliton, who's the head of the sleep lab in Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. So we're studying the sleep patterns of ME patients and try to understand, as we know, sleep problems is also one of these core symptoms of the patients. Another project I think I should mention is this collaboration with Jonas Bergquist's lab in Uppsala. As you know, he leads the Uppsala Center, where he looked at the cerebrospinal fluid of ME patients along with post-COVID patients. I think that's of unique importance as well, because in order to look at these potential problems in the central nervous system, CSF is a better system to look at, comparing to, for example, the blood system, which although it's much less invasive,
easier.
But, exactly. But there is this blood-brain barrier, so it's further away from the central nervous system. So the analysis of CSF provides us a unique opportunity to look into the central nervous system.
I think that's so important. All of these tests, although some of them are a little bit more invasive than others, such as the ICPET test, it's important because, the other option is the non-invasive ICPET, but it doesn't necessarily give us such an in-depth picture of really what's going on, nor does it give us the ability, especially because what you're doing is you're looking at these hallmark symptoms, post-exertion malaise, and seeing if you could understand the molecular mechanisms that are driving this core symptom, as well as especially sleep disturbance as well, is so important to look at, because unrefreshing sleep is such an important aspect of this. So to talk a little bit more, I know you mentioned this briefly, but I'm interested to hear more about what exactly the Systems Medicine for Disease Mechanisms and Treatments project means for understanding ME/CFS. So maybe if you could just explain that a little bit.
Sure, sure. So again, we know that human body is really a complex system,
Right.
and the disease really affects, multiple subsystems of our body, and that makes it difficult to study. So in terms of these organ systems that are affected by ME/CFS, we know that, at least the nervous system, the immune system, the metabolism system, and all these systems work together, and dysfunctions in, perhaps either one of these systems or multiple of them actually give rise to the symptoms that the patients experience. Mm. So our goal is essentially to understand, what's going on and how these systems work together, and which part we can actually treat in order to make the symptoms better. And our ultimate goal is obviously make the symptoms go away. So specifically, we have three approaches or three aims. One is to integrate existing studies of ME/CFS together. And this is particularly important because, as you know, the funding limitation is very significant in ME/CFS. And therefore, unlike many other diseases, most of the studies these days in ME/CFS are on small number of patients, and typically only look at one or two aspects of the disease. Therefore, it only provide information from one aspect of this complex system. Therefore, you really want to combine the information together to see, what are the consistent findings across multiple studies, because that would represent the consistent, signature of this disease. If something is not significant, is not consistent, would there be different groups of patients, just like many other diseases, for example, cancer? There are many subtypes of the disease, so we can actually treat them a little bit differently. These days we call precision medicine. And on top of that, we also want to integrate what we learned from not only one aspect of the disease, but multiple aspects of the disease. So people typically call this multi-omics integration. So we can actually draw strengths from different levels and put them together to better understand the disease. So this is one aspect. The second is to compare what we learned from ME/CFS with what we know biologically and from medical knowledge of all the other diseases, because ME is much less well studied comparing to many other diseases, for example, heart disease, or Alzheimer's, etc. So ideally, we would want to essentially leverage all those knowledge collected in biology and medicine, and integrate that with our studies in ME/CFS. We actually have started working on this we call knowledge-based network analysis for the past couple of decades, and applied it extensively in the studies of other diseases, for example, intensive care unit patients. This knowledge base, which, as we know, reflect the current understanding of disease and the molecular signatures, drugs, and all kinds of information, is really a wealth that we can use to study ME/CFS. So this what people call natural medicine these days, is basically trying to computationally take advantage of what we learned from other diseases in terms of clinical phenotypes, drugs, genes, proteins, metabolites, and all these other interactions, and compare that with what we learned in ME/CFS. The goal is to see what among all these diseases that we know so far, what are the diseases that would look most like ME/CFS, right. And hopefully that disease is well studied, so we can actually borrow strengths from the findings in that disease to help us to identify the focus of our studies in ME/CFS. For example, diagnostic biomarkers, disease mechanisms, and also in the ideal world, if that disease already has some effective drugs, so we can then consider whether to repurpose that drug, in ME/CFS through pilot clinical trials. So that's this sort of the second aspect of this project. The third aspect is the modeling of the interactions between the organ systems. So as you mentioned earlier, since blood is pretty much the focus of most of the studies in ME/CFS to date, and it's likely that the core dysfunctions occurring in some other systems, either central nervous system or let's say muscle. Therefore, there is this link between what we learn from blood with what's going on in the central nervous system or in the muscle system. So in order to solve this problem, we have to computationally actually also borrow what we know, the interaction between the blood, the central nervous system, with what's going on in the blood. And computationally model these interactions. So when we see some, biomarkers, let's say, metabolites or proteins change, in the blood, we can then infer that there must be a particular, biological pathway, either metabolic pathway or central nervous system pathway that is likely to be abnormal, that would link to what we observe in the blood. So that's the type of analysis that we're currently doing. Obviously, it's challenging just because each system is quite complex, but we're hoping that we'll get there with Open Massive Foundation support.
Thanks so much for explaining that a little bit more. I think that is so fascinating and also important, because if we can potentially find drugs that can be repurposed, that could really expedite the process of having drug targets, because as we know, developing new drugs entirely is extremely lengthy and difficult process. And I think it's also really interesting and important that you borrow from knowledge that you know from other disease groups. So just a little bit more about that. I'm curious, how do you decide which disease groups that you pull from when you're studying? How do you pick the comparisons?
Yeah, very, very good question. In the ideal world, we would basically look at all the diseases that people have studied, just because we really don't know what are the diseases that look similar to ME. So in our preliminary analysis, perhaps as expected, we find so far that a lot of neurological diseases and autoimmune diseases seem to be closer to ME/CFS, comparing with some other diseases such as heart disease or diabetes. So right now we're putting more focus on some of these diseases, for example, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson, and some of these other diseases, bipolar.
That's quite interesting. And I think also there's a lot of, especially when you mentioned before, critically ill patients. I know that's something that Dr. Bergquist at Uppsala is also looking at, these patients that were in ICU, because you could really find out a lot of information about what's going on with patients that are dealing with this kind of acute inflammation and what happens to the body directly following, say, an infection or critical injury or something that puts the body into a lot of stress. So I think this research is likely very important moving forward. And the fact that you're also providing this bridge between the collaborative centers with the data and being able to kind of just support all of the research going on through data analysis.
Yeah.
So something else another project that I think is really interesting, well, just in general, your ME/CFS Data Center platform is web-based. So it is a computational platform which allows the OMF-funded centers, as I was just saying, to store the data, to share, to visualize, and discuss these data sets and results, to disseminate the information. So I'm wondering if you could just talk more about how this is actually set up.
Sure. It's a very good question. As I mentioned earlier, I think the data sharing is actually of particular importance for ME/CFS research, perhaps even more important than some of the other diseases, just because, because of this funding limitation, a lot of ME/CFS studies these days are of small sample size and only look at, only look at one or two aspects. So in order to draw a conclusion and get insights on the disease mechanism, we actually need to, we have to look at multiple studies, and we have to look at multiple dimensions of the molecular assays. Therefore, one single lab, really cannot, generate all this data because of the, again, funding limitation and also the expertise of that particular lab. So we have to essentially learn what other people have learned. Therefore, data sharing is very important. And I think Open Medicine Foundation from early on decided rightfully that all the projects supported by OMF should be sharing their data quickly and effectively. Quickly meaning that sharing the data before they're published. So, we're essentially setting up this policy that, once the data are verified and validated, because, for any type of study in the beginning, there are going to be errors and mistakes made. So those are corrected locally. But once that's done, the data would be required to be submitted to our data center. And then the individual research lab can actually decide, whether they want to put some sort of understanding on how the data can be used, which is only fair because they generated the data, and they would want to have the right to, let's say, in some cases, publish first on that data set before other groups can publish on the same data set. But then the other groups can obviously look at the data before the data get published and discuss with this original lab some of their thoughts and findings. And that can only benefit actually the original data generator to make better use of that data and make their publications better. So that's essentially the goal that we try to facilitate. And during this process, we found out that a lot of clinical researchers, because they're not really trained into looking at what we call omics data, all the genes in the body, etc. They would typically need a lot of face-to-face discussions with us to support their analysis. For example, what this gene mean,
right.
etc. And therefore, we thought that perhaps it would be more effective if we build a online visualization and analysis platform, so they can actually do the analysis themselves, and that can facilitate this online collaboration and make the whole system working better. So that's why we developed the visualization and the analysis system online, and hopefully that can help individual labs to look at especially other people's data which they're not really typically familiar with. However, we find that at least up to now, these modulators job is still necessary, just because the data often is just too specialized and complex. Therefore, they still want to get somebody that they can talk to when they have questions on particular findings.
That's, I think, especially now, so in a virtual world, this online collaboration is even more important than ever. And it kind of connects all of the researchers on a global front, and being able to have someone to also explain the data, as you mentioned, it's different and it's more complicated, I believe. So having someone to help paint a picture about really what it means is very important.
Exactly.
So another project that I know Open Medicine Foundation mentioned last year and recently is called the Personalized Automatic Symptom Summary, so PASS. And it basically uses this computerized adaptive testing. And it's a project that you're working on in collaboration with Boston University.
Yes.
So the purpose is to develop this assisted diagnostic tool for these multi-system chronic complex diseases. So I'm wondering, this is an exciting project, and it holds a lot of promise for patients. So I was wondering if you could just elaborate more on how this will help patients in their diagnosis process, how it will help save time assessing the patients and giving them a more informative tool.
Yeah, sure. So this project was initiated by Dr. Rana Tompkins. As you mentioned earlier, we have this Rana Tompkins collaboration at Harvard. So he saw this gap, this significant need in the clinical care of ME/CFS early on, because it takes so long for atypical ME patients to be diagnosed through the primary care system. And that's largely because primary care physicians do not typically recognize this disease. So he teamed up with Luis Cazis, who was his long-term collaborator, who specialized in developing this computerized adaptive testing for other diseases to adapt some of their approaches for ME/CFS. And the idea is that if we have a test, or we call this PASS, Personalized Automated Symptom Summary, for specifically designed for ME/CFS, and it can give essentially hints to the primary care physicians that somebody might have a high probability of having ME/CFS, then perhaps this essentially physician's assistant tool can help the primary care physicians to recognize the possibility that a particular patient might have ME/CFS, and then the physician can refer this patient to ME specialists, or for particular lab tests and other examinations tailored to diagnosing ME/CFS. So that's sort of the general idea. And we've been working with Luis Cazzi's lab for the past year or two, trying to achieve this. And I think they're making good progress so far. For example, I actually just had a meeting before our discussion with Luis' group, because some of those symptoms, for example, post-exertion malaise, were not really well characterized for other diseases. So, they're essentially going over interviews with physicians and patients, coming up with better tests to essentially characterize the post-exertion malaise, as well as other brain fog, for example, other symptoms of ME/CFS. So that's the first step of this project, which is to generate a physician assistant tool for ME diagnosis for primary care physicians. The second step that we're starting to work on is to help patients to monitor their own symptoms over time, because especially for ME patients who got diagnosed with ME in a short period of time, as we know, they often experience this crash after exertion. So their symptoms would go up and down over time. And one need that we identified is to, hopefully develop a tool that would give the patient essentially a prediction of how likely that patient is leading toward a crash. So eventually, hopefully, this tool would predict, or essentially an early warning system for the patient, so the patient can tailor their activities before the crash happens. So this, we call this a common filter project. This is a second project, second aspect of this project that we're starting to work on. Obviously, this second piece should be combined with, some of these other wearable systems. So we're also looking at some of the wearable devices and the objective signals, sensor signals from those devices, and combine information from that type of devices with the PASCAD questionnaires, and hopefully by combining this, we can develop an algorithm using machine learning, and hopefully that can help patients to manage their symptoms better.
Oh, that is such an important piece of the puzzle. I think not only, I know there's a statistic that says the average patient with ME/CFS can take up to 5 years for a proper diagnosis. And if we could expedite that and help, because even to this day, I know this is potentially changing with long COVID now, unfortunately. Doctors, I believe, are more aware. But it's likely that these patients, because ME/CFS is still this diagnosis of exclusion, that they're getting all these different tests to rule things out, things are coming back negative and they don't have the answer. So it can take years to get a diagnosis. So this project I think, is just so promising in that regard. Not only that, but I think also pacing is such an important strategy when managing ME/CFS and long COVID as well. So if PASS can help in terms of symptom management and preventing crashes, this post-exertion malaise, that can really help, I believe, with prognosis over time, hopefully. It's a very exciting project. So thank you again for explaining all of these different, I know there's a lot going on in these centers, and I'm wondering a little bit more. So how did you get started personally in the field of ME/CFS research?
Sure. I've been working with Ron Davis at Stanford Genome Technology Center for I think 20 years now. I was a postdoc with him back in early 2000. Then, as you described earlier, I was a collaborator with Ron Davis and Ron Tompkins to study intensive care unit patients. And there we saw a lot of intensive care unit patients after they got discharged from the hospital. They have a really prolonged period of recovery. And we actually see this, as you know, all the time in COVID patients, unfortunately. So we saw those early on and actually came up with this term PICS, which people use these days as well. So as you probably know, Ron Davis' son, Whitney, unfortunately has a really severe version of ME/CFS. So I got involved early on trying to look at Whitney as well as other severely ill patients of ME/CFS, try to figure out, what could be potentially wrong with these patients. They're so severely ill, yet as you mentioned earlier, the traditional laboratory tests, etc., do not typically show a consistent difference between them and the normal people. And that's why the disease is not really well recognized until very recently. So that led us, Ron Davis, Ron Tompkins, and me start thinking about seriously looking into this disease. So working together with Linda and other staff in Open Medicine Foundation, we started to do research in this area. I think it has been 4 or 5 years now, and we're making progress. And I hope we can actually move on to the next step soon, which is basically conducting pilot clinical trials. I know that's one of the focuses of Open Medicine Foundation. And I think that's extremely important, because that would get to the step that potentially can actually help the patients.
I think that also is just very exciting for patients to hear as well, that we're moving into this phase. So when you talk about these pilot clinical trials, would you be looking at repurposing drugs?
Yeah, largely, I think both. As I mentioned earlier, the invasive CPET or non-invasive, even non-invasive CPET, we're trying to actually conduct study to be able to use the non-invasive CPET to mimic the results of invasive CPET. So that would make the tool much widely available. But in either case, the CPET provides us an objective way of measuring the effect of the drug. And I think that's extremely important just because, as we know, PM is such a hallmark of the disease, and CPET can quantitatively measure the performance of a patient. So currently in Dr. Systrom's lab, they have conducted at least a couple of pilot clinical trials where you would randomize the patients with either the drug or placebo, and then you would measure the outcome of the drug objectively. So I think this is probably at least one way of conducting a better clinical trial, especially important for this disease. Now then, for the drugs themselves, I think there's one type of drug specifically based on the hypothesis or the findings that we, along with all the researchers in ME/CFS, have found so far. For example, mitochondrial diseases, the autoimmune aspect of this, problems with the nervous system. It doesn't mean that all the patients would have all these dysfunctions. So it's important to actually identify which patient has which, likely have which dysfunction. And then, we would use CPET as a way to test drugs that target, for example, mitochondrial function, target nervous system dysfunction, so these type of drugs are, some of them are essentially drugs that the pharmaceutical companies have in their pipeline, so they're not really approved so far, unfortunately. And then, as you mentioned, there are a whole group of other drugs that have already been approved, and Dr. Systrom's lab are testing, I think, at least a couple of them that are exactly. Mestinon is actually one that that we actually just did a trial on that. And I think it's the paper is probably going to be accepted very soon in this journal, CHEST, to show the positive results, along with a few other drugs that have been approved for other diseases. So as you know, the benefit for this repurposing is just because those drugs have already been approved, the clinical trial would take much less time and much less money, and getting it approved for ME/CFS would take much less effort. So that's why we're putting, I think, more focus on this second group of drugs.
Right. And I think, like what you mentioned before, also with the subgrouping is so important with these patients.
Exactly.
For example, one patient might respond to Mestinon while another doesn't. So treating the different subgroups is such, like, this precision medicine, as you mentioned before, is just a really important aspect of this disease specifically.
Yep.
So thank you so much for all of your time and effort into researching this patient population. As you mentioned before, it's just woefully underfunded, and we have such limited research in it. And what you're doing is you're just helping provide so much insight into this disease. And I really do think this is going to be what leads to change down the line. So thank you so much for all of your time into this research effort.